Well, we're starting then to read Hegel. I'm not unrealistic enough to expect that you have already read Hegel, since you've just been doing an examination. But you will find that Hegel, while when you get his vocabulary and his style is fairly straightforward reading, initially he seems verbose. There's a little book by Brent Blanchard called On Philosophical Style, the literary style, if you can call it that, of philosophers, in which he suggests that people like Jonathan Swift and George Bernard Shaw would say that Major Andre was hanged. If H. Bradley, who's British idealist about the turn of the century, would say that he was killed, one of his colleagues, Bosanquet, would say he died. Kant would say his mortal existence achieved its termination. And Hegel would tell us that a finite determination of infinity had been further determined by its own negation. But if you were listening, you caught in that final statement of what it means to say that Major Andre was killed, you caught an expression of Hegel's dialectic. Listen to it once again. A finite determination of infinity. Yes, the infinite, the absolute, the all-inclusive being. Now, a finite determination of that, that's an individual. Okay, the thesis, he exists, had been further determined by its own negation. Yes, his existence is negated, giving further specificity to that event, to that period in history. So, to say a person is killed comes, you see, with all sorts of trailing implications. And what Hegel is doing in simply the simple idea that this guy was killed is seeing it as part of a much larger picture. Well, it may be a matter of literary style, but quite plainly the philosophical framework that he's working with comes out in his style. So let me start then our discussion of Hegel by reminding you of the things that I said last time concerning these German idealists generally. I may not be not unrealistic enough to think that you've already read Hegel, having just done an exam, but I am realistic enough to think that you have likely forgotten what we said about the German idealists last time. So let's pick up a little bit there. I said we were going to get a new metaphysic. Absolute idealism, in which every individual event and entity is an expression of the all-inclusive process. So that your self-consciousness is just a passing moment in the self-consciousness of the divine. The divine which is working out its full freedom and self-expression in the course of history. So that Hegel saw, for instance, Napoleon. They were, after all, contemporaries. He saw Napoleon that way, as embodying in an individual way, distinctive, but in a world-significant way, embodying the free, creative movement of the spirit of a culture in history. You see? Overcoming all opposition in the past. The sovereignty of creative spirit. Now, this is obviously not a mechanistic cause-effect model. It's a process model that sees organic interrelatedness of everything within the all-inclusive one. So if you're talking then about the place of Napoleon in history, Hegel would do it this way, that all history converges on that individual, that event, and all history opens up from that point on. You see. History gives birth to Napoleon, and the Napoleonic event is pregnant with all the future history. You see. So he calls Napoleon a world historical figure. A world historical figure. One in whom the past is summed up, and one that is loaded with future. Get the notion of process and organic interrelatedness. They're very figures of speech, or biological figures. So that metaphysical monism, absolute idealism, a monistic idealism, everything is spirit at work, freedom bursting out all over, is Hegel, very much romanticist. Now, while that's one side of his metaphysic, it is, I think, one which has come to be appreciated more in the 20th century, perhaps the second two-thirds of the 20th century, than it was appreciated in the early part of the 20th century. If you pick up works on Hegel that were written in the period from 1900 to about 1930, 40, you will find that he's depicted as a rationalist rather than a romanticist. And, well, maybe, but certainly not in the 18th century sense. He's depicted as a rationalist because he says that the real is rational, and the rational is real. So he seems to be saying that whatever you decide is rationally necessary, that's the way reality is, which sounds very rationalistic. But what does he mean by the statement? That's the question. What does he mean by the statement? He means that the real is a creative manifestation. Everything that's real is a creative manifestation. Oopsie, I'm not even spelling it right. Manifestation of mind, spirit. That's what the real is. And so, of course, to say that everything that's real is a creative manifestation of spirit is to say, in that sense, it's as rational as spirit is. The real is rational. And to say that the rational is real is simply to say that the categories of thought which structure creative thinking and creative activity, that the categories of thought are also categories of reality. Which is, of course, just what Aristotle had thought. That the categories of thought are also categories of reality. So that when we get into his logic in just a little while, we'll be seeing that he spells out all sorts of categories, logical categories, that remind you in a way of Kant's categories. Kant had said the categories of thought are purely subjective, they're only categories of thought. Hegel says, phooey, they're categories of reality. except that he says it in German.
How does he move from Kant's position to his position?
Well, that's what we'll have to see. Obviously a good question. But the categories of thought are also categories of reality. So keep in mind that the starting point for Hegel is the all-inclusive creative spirit, whose creativity is being freely manifested in the ongoing movement of history. Now, that's the second theme in his metaphysic, but there's a third theme. And the third theme, in a way, is an echo of the earliest Greek thought. Now, if you can cast your mind back to about 400 or 500 BC, or alternatively just to last August and September, you'll remember that even before the pre-Socratics got going, in the Greek poets like Hesiod, to some extent Homer, Sophocles, Aeschylus, there's the recognition that the universe as a whole is an ordered unity, of which a just society, a well-ordered society, a city-state, is a microcosm, of which a just person with a well-ordered moral life is a further minicosm. So that you get this macrocosm, microcosm business, and the individual and the historical state and the universe as a whole are all made in the same image. Ordered unity. Now, that's what underlay the logos concept of the pre-Socratics and the theory of forms that as it develops in Plato. You remember that story, I hope. Well, Hegel likewise, and he uses the term logos. You see, Hegel sees the individual as a microcosm of the whole. You're a microcosm of what absolute spirit is. You're in the image of God. And the state, and he's thinking of the nation state, since this is Romanticism in the 19th century. You see, and the nation state is a further microcosm of the whole, a manifestation of creative spirit at work in history. You see. So when we get to his major work, The Phenomenology of Mind, the German term is Geist, which is perhaps better translated spirit, like the old Anglo-Saxon word ghost, Geist. You see. The Phenomenology of Spirit, we'll find that his description, while he talks of self first and then society and then culture in a whole historical sense, what he's doing is unfolding, as it were, this mental meandering that traces the dialectical unfolding of self-conscious